Hi. Well, here in New Zealand, we've had a bit of a furore in the last couple of days. A bit of a storm and a storm in a teacup furore, I must admit. Furore, get that word right, I must admit, when it comes to in the grand scheme of things. But we've had a news outlet called News Hub, and our News Hub are a news organisation which are on limited time. They're due to shut down in a couple of weeks, I think, just due to them not being viable, financially viable. And anyway, News Hub have been one of the news outlets here in New Zealand we consider the mainstream media, or amongst those. Obviously not mainstream enough if they're on their way out. And they have been amongst those who have been atrocious when it comes to condemning women or anyone who says that men who say they're women are not women and they shouldn't be in women's sports and spaces. So I have no regrets that News Hub are on their way out, and I just hope the door doesn't hit them in the rear end as they go. So anyway, it's been, they always misrepresent things the way they are. They always come at it with from the angle of poor trans, and never consider women. And if women are ever mentioned, it's always interviewing women who say things like, "Oh, I don't mind. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I'm happy with this." They never interview women who say, "No, there's something seriously wrong with this. I don't like it." And that, to be honest, they might be hard pushed to find women like that, especially if they're actually sort of women who may be in danger of losing their place on a sports team, or having work colleagues or anything like that, or family or friends sort of dump on them from a great height. And I've heard that that happens, and it's pretty awful. I've heard of women whose family, whose kids basically hold them to ransom. You dare say anything like this and I won't let you see the kids again, your grandchildren, stuff like that. So it's pretty dire, but and I think it's really important to frame this, because the media won't, to frame this in the way it is. And the way it is that the control of women's spaces and sports have been handed to men, or has been handed to men, I should say. And there's no other way of putting it. That is how it is. Not when we have policies that say any man who says he's a woman can go into women's spaces and play on women's sports, and this is at community level I'm talking about at the moment, because international level things have changed a bit in some areas. But any man who says he's a woman can go into women's spaces or play on women's sports if he so wants to. And he can identify as a woman for 10 minutes, for an hour, just as long as perhaps the sports game lasts, and then he can go back to being a man. There's no conditions at all, nothing, and women are supposed to accept this. And of course, we're supposedly hateful and everything like that if we don't. So it's really important to frame this in the way it is, and that men have now been handed control of women's spaces and sports. Now, not all men will choose to identify as a woman and go into women's spaces or sports. Some men wouldn't dream of it. Absolutely not. Just beyond the pale. And there are others who will think, get a few bevies on board, think it's a bit of a lark, go into women's toilets. And then those are just opportunistic. They'll just want to do it because they're just basically a-holes. And women can't do anything about it. Nothing. The choice is completely in men's hands. They control the scene. They control it. They choose whether or not they want to say they're a woman and come into women's spaces and sports. And women may never, I mean, it's possible that some women may never, excuse me, may never encounter a man in their space or sports in their life, but they do not have any control over whether or not they do. They go into those spaces or sports not knowing whether there'll be a man there or not. And if there is, you can't do anything about it. The only time you can do anything about it is if they behave badly. And then you have to go and get somebody to come and sort it out. If the man is still there, if he's still behaving badly, it's your word against theirs. Who knows what the manager or whoever's going to sort of facilitate this, who knows what decision they'll make. But anyway, I wrote something a bit about that, so I thought I would read it out. I wrote on my Substack. For those who know my Substack, you may have read it already. For others, I'll put the link to that below, and you can read it if you want to, or read other things. Right, I'll just go and find it and read it out. Right, so now I've headed it up. Now that men have been given control of female spaces in New Zealand, what do we do from here? If there's anyone left in New Zealand who thinks that women's and girls' spaces are still a female domain, then you must be living in a place where that quaint tradition hasn't yet been demolished. Please let me know where that place is. For the rest of us, we have to submit to the presence of any man whomsoever says he's a woman in our spaces, bushy beard, bollocks and all. This is despite the independent UK having collected data way back in 2018, which showed that unisex changing rooms put women at more danger of sexual assault. Oh, but I guess this doesn't apply to the Aotearoa New Zealand context, as is the latest fob-off we hear from our public service and politicians to any data or reports from overseas they don't like. They're not averse to claiming in the next breath, when circumstances suit them, though, that they're following international best practice. If we don't like having a man in our female space, we are the ones who have to remove ourselves and go into a private cubicle instead, if available. Not all men will say they're women and intrude into female spaces, thank goodness, but the choice of whether or not they do say they are is utterly and completely in their hands. Men now have total control over whether or not they use female facilities, whilst women and girls have none. Even if we never encounter a bloke in our female spaces, we now have to go into them knowing that there could be, and there's nothing we can do. In places where the powers that be have decided to have only unisex cubicles as a clever solution, it's not. Besides the issue of men in general having poorer behaviours of hygiene, and yes, I know, not all men and some women too, there's also a greater risk of creepy and/or predatory men lurking around unisex bathrooms unchallenged. The installation of undetectable spy cameras in unisex cubicles is easy peasy, and even menstrual products can get fished from bins and disposal units and used for sexual gratification. Although this is the first legal case of its kind in New Zealand, you can bet your last dollar that it doesn't mean it's an isolated incident. And I have put a link here to that news report about a man who did that very thing here in New Zealand and went to court over it. But don't get me started on those toilets where urinals and cubicles are all in the same room for both women and men to use together. I don't care if all the oh-so-progressive tiny thinkers declare they don't mind. What about all those who do? Sure, they make themselves use the facilities when that's all that's on offer, but reread the above paragraphs and then ask, who do these type of arrangements suit the most? I heard a while back that there's a town in New Zealand where the council replaced their female and male single-sex public toilets with a block of back-to-back rows of unisex toilets. Some residents promptly designated with their own signage, one side for female use and the other side for male use. The signage was removed, but the residents were having none of it and replaced it with designated female and male signage again. To my knowledge, that signage remains. If anyone knows the name of this town, the residents who did that, deserve an accolade. The New Zealand First political party have introduced a members' bill to Parliament for all new public buildings to have single-sex female and male toilets, as well as unisex ones. It will surprise no one that the radical neo-left and our mainstream media had a meltdown over this anti-trans bill because, gasp, men who say they're women might have to use a unisex toilet instead of invading women's. Of course, we've had unisex toilets for years as a requirement in public buildings, but because they often had a wheelchair logo on them to show that they were wheelchair accessible, trans activists declared it was unfair to make trans people use them, as it could indicate that transgenderism was a disability. They've been exceptional creators of many a spurious claim in the pursuit of enabling men who say they're women to use female toilets. Whether or not New Zealand First Bill will be passed remains to be seen, but with the number of public servants and politicians we have who consider it anti-trans to not give trans people everything they want, it could be dicey. Trans activists have had the march on us for decades. They have been as devious as all heck with the inroads they've made into eroding women's and girls' rights. The sales pitches to politicians, unworthy of their office, was well honed and expertly executed. Somehow the fact that much of it was for the benefit of men who say they're women either bypassed these politicians or they didn't care, or they liked that aspect. So good was the trans activists' work under cover of darkness, so to speak, we never had a clue how much they were undermining women's and girls' rights until we started losing those rights. We were caught well on the back foot, and we've been trying to make headway with stopping the erosion of women's and girls' rights ever since. Back in 2018, the first whispers were heard that a sex self-ID bill was going to be sneaked into law in New Zealand. Sure enough, the Greens had surreptitiously inserted it into an innocuous updating of the Births, Deaths, Marriages and Relationships Registration Act. This was a similar ploy used in other countries to evade scrutiny of it. It didn't work the first time round here, but after a renewed effort later on amid much controversy, it was passed into law in mid-2023. The fight against it did, however, get an amendment made which said that a birth certificate does not have to be taken as evidence of a person's sex in New Zealand, and other factors can be taken into account, e.g., what our ears and eyes show and tell us. Even before 2018, people, mostly women, were sounding the alarm in New Zealand, and yet where are we with women and girls losing our rights to men who say they're women? Our public service and our councils are determinedly entrenching policies that prioritise those men over women more and more. Added to that is the trans activist targeting of kids. New Zealand has prescribed puberty blockers to young people at 10 times the rate of the UK per head of population, and the Ministry of Education's Relationships and Sexuality Education guidelines for schools have gender ideology embedded in them, all upon the advice from TQ plus lobby groups. There is so much more that could be said about how trans and gender ideology has permeated our public service, councils, universities, schools, our Ministry for Women, the National Council of Women, United Nations Women, corporations, and the minds of those who think there's no harm in being kind to just a scant handful of men who say they're women. I used to be one of the latter. I learned, though, that when it comes to pushing and breaking down women's and children's boundaries, there is no such thing as just a scant handful of men. There are many men who would never consider breaking women's and children's boundaries, and there are those who are only held back by boundaries. Despite considerable, brilliant, and dogged work over the years done by individuals and groups to try and halt this erosion of women's and girls' rights, the erosion continues. Neither have we been able to protect children from gender ideology here in New Zealand so far. However, some progress has been made in raising more public awareness about the harms of gender ideology. Seeing and sensing this groundswell, a few businessmen who knew each other and had been concerned for some time about how gender ideology is harmfully permeating everything, everywhere, got together and created a new group called Inflection Point. They planned an event called Unsilenced to bring all the disparate individuals and groups together who care about women, children, and young people. It was a huge success. But boy, did it have some detractors and would-be saboteurs. And I have linked to another story about that in this at the bottom of this blog I'm reading out. To carry on. Amongst the detractors were people who dissed the event because it included Christians. Supposedly, Christians and those of us who don't follow that faith should avoid each other at all times due to holding some opposite beliefs, even when we have the common threat of gender ideology. Even when it's at all our doors, we should remain pure in our separatism and snub each other instead of facing the enemy together. The purists can be damned. I want to win this fight against that which is destroying women's and girls' rights and safety, not win some purity contest. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but at the same time, none of us needs anyone else's permission about who we do or don't ally with. Still, let's be honest, neither Christians nor those who aren't Christian know how successful an alliance between the two of us will be. However, we can either take a risk and come together to create a bigger force against gender ideology, or not do it and keep fighting our own separate little battles. I'm choosing what I believe will work right here and now. That is item-specific collaboration. We can still maintain our independent positions over those things we disagree on, but parking those differences for a common goal is a well-used strategy in warfare, for good reason. It may only ever be a loose alliance of convenience, but right now, that works for me. We all took a calculated risk in turning up to Unsilenced, but as the saying goes, fortune favours the bold. Unlike the neo-left, there are no nasty surprises with Christians or those who are right-leaning. We know their beliefs and their agendas, and they know ours. And a funny old thing has happened. I've discovered I very much like some of those Christian people, differences and all. They were a lot kinder too about the trans activists protesting the Unsilenced event outside the venue than I was. Okay, that's it. As I said, I will put the link to my Substack blog below for further reading if you're interested. And hopefully I shall be back again in due course with another guest. Okay, bye for now.